Dead Space 2 is the best game in the series. Or at least it is in my humble opinion. I love this game so much. It's easily my favorite Dead Space game, remake included, and it's one of my favorite games of all time. I just feel like Visceral Games absolutely knocked it out of the park with this one. In fact, they didn't just knock it out of the park, they knocked it out of the solar system. I feel like sequels to brand new games, like Dead Space was at the time, are always a proving ground for the series. It's where you find out if it truly has the potential of being a series, or if it was just a one-time lightning in a bottle kind of thing. Sure, you made an amazing game that a lot of people love, but can you do it again but bigger and better? The answer isn't always yes, and sometimes a sequel pales in comparison to its predecessor. Sometimes developers or publishers or whoever you want to blame take the wrong lessons from the success of a game and make something that just misses the mark entirely. Like Devil May Cry 2, which on paper seemed like it would be a good follow-up, but just fell completely flat in every department. It can be a tricky balancing act. You have to recapture everything people loved in the first game while also letting the sequel have an identity of its own. It needs to add enough new stuff so it doesn't feel like glorified DLC, while also not being different enough that it feels like a different game entirely. Be it story, gameplay, or graphics, there has to be improvement in some or all of these areas. Obviously, what makes a good sequel can vary from person to person, but I feel like most people can agree that just doing the same thing again is just kind of boring. For me personally, Dead Space 2 is the perfect example of a sequel that just nails every aspect of being a sequel. As far as I'm concerned, Visceral Games created a perfect sequel with this game. So, in this video, I want to talk about all the things I love about Dead Space 2 and explain why I think it's the best game in the series. So let's go ahead and actually do that. Before we really get into it, there won't be spoilers for this game until the end, but I am going into this video assuming we're all aware of what happened in the first game. If you aren't, then don't panic. I already made a video about that game that you can check out to learn everything you need to know. Feel free to watch that, then come right back here to finish this video. I don't mind. Alright, we good? Good. The first thing I want to talk about with this game is the gameplay. Dead Space 2 basically improves every aspect of gameplay the first Dead Space established. Now, I realize that's a hefty claim, but I can say that with a lot of confidence because I have played both games extensively. To be fair, the developers already had a fantastic groundwork in place from the first game. Despite being more than 15 years old at this point, the gameplay of Dead Space 1 has aged incredibly well. It still feels great to play, and they did a lot that innovated the survival horror genre in some really interesting ways. The stasis and kinesis modules helped give Dead Space's gameplay an identity of its own that helped it stand out from its contemporaries. Dead Space 2 carries over all the mechanics and gameplay elements from Dead Space and improves nearly all of them. Some in more noticeable ways than others, but I think pretty much everything is upgraded to a certain degree. Even the way Isaac moves within the gameplay is quicker and significantly less clunky, which makes the overall gameplay smoother. Stasis is relatively unchanged aside from the fact that it will now recharge over time, so you no longer have to rely on stasis packs as much. Don't get me wrong, you will still need them since the timed recharge isn't going to do you much good when you're being overwhelmed. Stasis packs also stack in inventory now, which is a small touch, but one that I really appreciate. Kinesis has also gotten a massive upgrade for Dead Space 2. While you could technically throw the limbs of enemies back at them in Dead Space 1, it didn't have a lot of practical use. It could be done, but wasn't really worth doing. At least for me, I never bothered with it. However, in this game, it has been beefed up and is easily one of the most effective ways to kill your enemies. Dead Space 2 allows you to use the blades and claws of dead enemies to impale other enemies. This is a super fun addition to the combat that will change how you approach each enemy encounter. It can also save you a ton of ammo if used properly, which is a pretty great bonus. Kinesis is more instant this time around too. Items you grab snap into position immediately as opposed to the slow drag that they would sometimes do in Dead Space 1. This is another instance of gameplay just being quicker and more responsive, making it all feel smoother. Even the remake doesn't do kinesis as well as it's done in this game. You are almost always guaranteed to grab the item or object you are attempting to grab with kinesis first try, much less grabbing the entire body rather than the stabby bit you actually want. Even the locator system got a bit of an upgrade. You can now change what the locator is currently locating, which means you can use it to find stores, benches, and save points, along with whatever your current objective is. I don't use this feature a ton due to the more linear nature of the game, but it definitely comes in handy every once in a while. Probably the biggest change to gameplay is the completely reworked and upgraded zero-G sections. Dead Space 1 had you space jumping from flat surface to flat surface, and that was fine, I guess. Dead Space 2 is where the zero-G sections were changed to a floating and flying system that, in my opinion, is just a lot more fun. It's very Iron Man, and I like it significantly more than in jumping about. It can still be very disorienting, but you can realign yourself with the ground with a simple press of a button. And again, Dead Space 2 does this better than the remake. In the remake, the reorienting is slow and doesn't really work all the time. I feel like I have to press and hold the button to get it to work properly. Here, you just press it and Isaac instantly aligns with the ground. It's probably less realistic this way or whatever, but it's much nicer from a gameplay perspective. The zero-G sections in general are more robust and interesting to play through this time around thanks to this big change. I don't know, I just think it's a lot more fun to fly around in a completely 3D space than awkwardly jump from one spot to another. I mean, they changed the zero-G sections to play like this in the remake, so I think it's safe to say it's the more popular choice, even though they did it worse in the remake. On top of all those changes, they also added new weapons and enemies to spice up the gameplay even more. One of the new weapons is my second favorite gun in the whole series, and that is the wonderful javelin gun. It's kind of like a harpoon gun if you could shoot electricity through the harpoon after it's been fired. It's just insanely satisfying to use in combat, and I really enjoy shocking the corpses of my enemies. In addition to the javelin gun, there's also the seeker rifle, which is the closest thing to a sniper rifle Dead Space is ever going to get, and the detonator, which is pretty much a standard mine launcher. All the original guns from Dead Space return, and a couple of them have even been modified to suck less. The pulse rifle's alt fire has been altered to being just a regular old grenade launcher rather than that dumb over the head circle thing from before. A little more of a basic alt fire, sure, but a much more practical one. The returning of new weapons still help keep each combat encounter fresh and exciting, especially if you switch up what weapons you've got on you. This is an instance of not fixing what isn't broken, and it was definitely the right call to just add a few new weapons rather than changing how the weapons worked entirely. Cough cough, Dead Space 3, cough cough. Along with the new guns, there are some new necromorphs, and again, this is an example of just adding to what already worked great. There aren't a ton of new enemies, but there are enough added to the game to make combat encounters even more diverse than Dead Space 1. You have the puker enemies, which have a long-range spitting attack that pretty much acts as stasis on Isaac. If you get hit with it, your movement is significantly slowed down, and this gives the necromorphs the advantage. There are also the new stalker enemies that attack in larger areas where they can utilize group tactics to distract and flank Isaac. The AI with these guys can be a bit finicky, but they can do a lot of damage if you aren't careful. I love these guys because it really enforces the idea of the necromorphs being somewhat intelligent. Again, the AI can be a bit finicky, but they still manage to stress me out every time I have to deal with them. Even the Leapers are more of a threat in this game. In OG Dead Space, Leapers were kinda silly looking when they jumped around, and I honestly couldn't take them seriously. In Dead Space 2, however, I have to take them seriously because if I don't, they will absolutely wreck my health. Maybe it's just my imagination, but I think they are much more aggressive and more efficient in this game, which in turn makes them more trouble to deal with. Once again, this is Visceral just improving what worked great in the first game. They didn't have to reinvent the wheel, they just gave us some new and unique necromorphs along with the old ones to fight for our lives against. A good sequel builds on what worked great the first time, and this is a perfect example of that. The necromorphs are one of the best aspects of the Dead Space games, and they did such a great job of building on said aspect in the sequel. There's enough new elements and changes to make it feel fresh and different while simultaneously feeling familiar and recognizable. Visceral did an amazing job of balancing those concepts with Dead Space 2, and that's a big part of why I love it so much. Now, a big question that comes with a sequel to anything horror related is it as scary as the first one? The answer is honestly no. I can pretty safely say that overall Dead Space 2 isn't as scary as Dead Space 1, at least as long as you've played Dead Space 1 already. I don't really count that against the game, however, because it's something that is fundamentally difficult to accomplish in horror in general. The thing with scary movies and games and whatnot is that the scary aspects tend to lose their effectiveness the more they are used. A lot of what makes horror actually scary is the unknown and surprising elements utilized, and once those things are no longer unknown or surprising, then they are no longer as scary. Therefore, the horror of Dead Space 2 isn't going to hit as hard or be as effective the second time around. Does that mean the game isn't still scary at all? Of course not. There are still new unknowns and surprises to experience, but at the end of the day, you've seen a lot of this before if you played the first game. It's just less scary overall. I'm also not the best judge of how scary Dead Space 2 is for the same reasons I mentioned in my Dead Space video. I've played this game so many times that I know pretty much everything that happens. I hope what I said made some kind of sense, but if it didn't, just know that while it's not as scary as the first game, there is still plenty of horror in Dead Space 2. In fact, there's a new-ish facet of the horror that I believe is used better in this game than the first one. Before we get into that, this is a reminder that we're going to be talking about the story of Dead Space 1 and the effects it has on the story of Dead Space 2. If you haven't played the first game and don't want it spoiled, then skip ahead or watch my video on that game. Same thing applies to anyone who wants to experience the story of Dead Space 2 as unspoiled as possible. While not major story points or spoilers, I do want to talk about some stuff that may be considered spoilish to some, so dip out now if that applies to you. The events of Dead Space 1 and his exposure to the marker has left Isaac's mind completely broken. The death of Nicole and the effects of the marker messing with his brain has given Isaac a special case of space dementia, which causes him to hallucinate. Throughout the events of Dead Space 2, Isaac is haunted by the memories of his dead girlfriend and the guilt of her death. I love this a ton because I feel like it adds so much to not only the horror and the creepiness of Dead Space 2, but also the character of Isaac Clarke. The story of Dead Space 2 is a much more personal journey compared to OG Dead Space because it's all about him facing what he believes to be his failure to save Nicole, and the loneliness that would come with accepting her death. Well, that and the fact that he actually talks and has a personality this time.
It's okay. How you doing?
The hallucinations he confronts are some of the creepiest and most terrifying moments in the game. It's much more than just voices whispering in your ear during quiet moments. One of my favorite characteristics of the marker is how it messes with people and manipulates them using their own thoughts and feelings. You get a taste of that in the first game and much more so in the remake, but Dead Space 2 dives right into the deep end, and it's incredible. I just think the psychological torment of the marker and its mindfucking works so well combined with the physical body horror of the necromorphs. They really complement and play off each other in a lot of interesting ways that makes the game scarier as a whole. Hallucinations caused by the marker lead to some of the best moments in the entire series. I mean, the big twist in the first game is thanks to the marker and its mind games. Even without the bigger emphasis on hallucinations and psychological horror, there are a ton of really terrifying parts of Dead Space 2. One of the most bone-chilling sections of the game has you traveling through an elementary school in the midst of a necromorph outbreak. The Church of Unitology is also a really eerie location to explore, and now that I'm thinking about it, maybe we should finally talk about the story and locations of Dead Space 2. Quick thoughts for those of you who just want to know if the story is good. Yes it is. It's more straightforward than the story of Dead Space 1, but that doesn't make it worse. The world building is still there, but feels less special, and I think a big part of that is due to the location of the game being much bigger. Rather than the majority of the game taking place on one ship, Dead Space 2 takes place on a massive space station and has you moving through several different locations within it. So the world building is less focused simply because you spend less time in the various areas. Like I mentioned earlier, Isaac speaks now, so he feels like he has a much bigger impact on the story and therefore has more urgency as a character. The game overall is more of an action horror game than a survival horror game, and I think a big part of that is the more cinematic presentation of the game. The cutscenes play out in a more standard way than Dead Space 1, but I think it works really well for this game and the story being told. The story is bigger in scope and adds a lot of really cool bits of lore to the universe that builds brilliantly off the concepts that Dead Space 1 introduced. I think this game is a prime example of taking the story and lore from its predecessor and expanding it in a way that makes sense. The story in this game is a thrilling continuation of the first that is immensely satisfying to experience. I really love the world building they did in this game, and that is yet another area that Dead Space 2 excels in. Similar to OG Dead Space's baseline story, Dead Space 2's main story isn't the most interesting part of the game. The more interesting part of the story is the world of the game and the lore it provides. Dead Space as a series just has some of the best lore and world building in any horror franchise ever. I'm a bit biased because I played as a kid and sci-fi is just my favorite genre of anything ever, but still, Dead Space in general is just an amazing combination of cosmic horror, body horror, zombie horror, and psychological horror, all wrapped up neatly with great aesthetics and an engrossing overarching story. Dead Space 2 is an important part of all that, because this is the game where they really started to expand the world and lore. Sure, you had spin-offs like Extraction that explore the events of Dead Space from a new and different perspective, but Dead Space 2 is where the larger universe of the games got introduced. You finally get to see more of the universe outside of the Ishimura and Aegis 7. Okay, with that out of the way, let's dig a little deeper into some of the story's details. Final warning for spoilers about Dead Space 2 because I'm about to go all in on the story. I'm not holding anything back past this point in the video, so just be aware. Let's start with the location of the game, Titan Station. Also known as the Sprawl, it is a space station built on what is left of one of Saturn's moons. Now, admittedly, the Sprawl isn't as iconic as the Ishimura, but I do think it has one major advantage over it: variety. Don't get me wrong, the Ishimura does a lot with its setting and takes you to some really interesting areas of the ship, but ultimately it's just one mining vessel. The Sprawl, however, can take you through a hospital, an elementary school, a crazy people church, and underground moon mines, and it doesn't even need a tram to do it. Except for that one time, I guess. Granted, you don't spend as much time in each of these locations, but that's honestly fine with me. The game does a great job of keeping you moving through the Sprawl at a clip, so you spend just the right amount of time in each area. You get to experience what there is to experience, then you move on to the next location. At one point, you even revisit the Ishimura in what is one of the coolest sections of any video game ever. After the events of Dead Space, EarthGov recovered the Ishimura and brought it to the Sprawl to be repaired and refurbished. During the story, Isaac has to make his way through the Ishimura, and it's easily one of the best parts of the whole game. It's just insanely cool to explore the Ishimura in this context, and it's one of the creepiest and most disturbing parts of the game. I love seeing how they tried to cover and hide the scars of what really went on the ship, and it almost feels like walking through a haunted house. From a story perspective, it's an important moment for Isaac since he is literally forced to revisit the source of his trauma.
Ellie, I'm in. There should still be a computer in the flight lounge. I can check the ship's status from there.
Are you okay? You sound a little nervous.
Last time I was here, things didn't go so well. Look, I'll contact you soon.
It also does a lot to just show how much bigger the Sprawl is in comparison. You can even see the Ishimura a few times in the background before you properly revisit it, which is a nice reward for people paying attention. This is one of my favorite sections of the whole game, and I couldn't find a better place in the video to bring it up, so there you go. Now, I'm not going to do a full breakdown of the story. I just don't really want to. Rather, I just want to talk about some of the aspects and story beats that I actually have something to say about. Plus, this is the spoiler part of the video, so you probably already know what happens in the story anyway. First, I want to say I really like the inclusion of Ellie and Strauss. I have no idea if this was intentional or if I'm just reading too much into it, but I feel like those two characters represented two different sides of Isaac. With Ellie, you have a regular person just trying to survive an outbreak of monsters and demons. She's smart, resourceful, and most of all, she's a survivor. She reflects those aspects of Isaac. Whereas with Strauss, you have a crazed shell of a man whose psyche has been completely broken by the Marker's influence. Much like Isaac, Strauss is dealing with feelings of guilt and failure due to the death of his wife and son, who he killed with his own hands thanks to the Marker's dementia. If Ellie is the reflection of sane regular Isaac, then Strauss is the reflection of Isaac's internal struggle. Like I said, I might just be reading too much into it, but I think it makes for an interesting discussion nonetheless. Maybe I'll start doing lore videos just to see if there's any weight to this idea. If you played the game, then let me know what you think of this theory down below. The other important part of the story I want to talk about is how Dead Space 2 deals with the big twist at the end of Dead Space 1. Nicole, Isaac's girlfriend, is dead. She killed herself to escape the disaster of the Ishimura, and Isaac never really gets a chance to properly process her death. 3 years take place between Dead Space 1 and 2, but Isaac remembers none of that time. So when we rejoin him at the start of the game, the wound of Nicole's death is still very fresh. This whole concept is easily the best part of the story and is some of the best writing in the entire franchise.
Why do you keep fighting me? Why can't you let go? Because you are my everything. And if I let you go, I've got nothing left.
Step 4. Acceptance. Now you're ready to finish this.
Isaac is literally haunted by Nicole being manifested by his dementia, and has literally no choice but to face her. This is another interesting facet of Strauss's inclusion in the story too. The parallels between Strauss and Isaac mean that Strauss's broken psyche and eventual death are what await Isaac if he doesn't face his guilt head on. All this leads to one of the most potent moments in the series, and the best and most dramatic boss fight in the whole franchise. I really might do a deeper dive into the story of the Dead Space games because there's just so much here worth talking about. In terms of Dead Space's 2 overall impact on the larger world of Dead Space, I think once again, Visceral Games did a great job. The objective and functionality of the markers is explored in further depth and is absolutely fascinating to see fleshed out. While Convergence's true purpose isn't revealed until Dead Space 3, the concept itself was first introduced in this game and plays a major part in the story. You also get to see more of the Unitology religion and how deep rooted it is in Dead Space's society. You even visit the Unitology recruitment center that gives off major Scientology vibes, and the two religions have a ton of interesting parallels. You find out a ton more about EarthGov and the experiments they are running on people affected by the markers and the markers themselves. The main human antagonist of the game is even an official for EarthGov who needs Isaac dead so he can't destroy the marker they made. EarthGov made another marker that caused the deaths of thousands of people. At this point in the universe, this is like the 4th time that has happened. Real classy, EarthGov. Sequels can be a hard thing to get right, and if you ask me, Dead Space 2 is an example of a sequel that just did everything right. The horror may not hit as well the second time around, but nearly every other aspect of the game does. The gameplay is tighter and smoother, the story is bigger and better, and even the graphics are improved. I mean, both games were PlayStation 3 games, so it's not much better, but I think Visceral managed to make a cleaner looking game within the same generation. Dead Space is still a classic, and I love it to death, but Dead Space 2? Dead Space 2 is on a whole nother level for me. I legitimately think I've played Dead Space 2 more than any other game in my entire life. It just has a very special place in my heart, so thanks for listening to me rant about it for however long this video ends up being. Obviously, check the game out if you haven't, it really is that good. And look, I didn't forget about the Severed DLC that was on consoles. It'll be featured in another video. I'm grouping it in with all the other spin-off games like Extraction, Ignition, and even the surprisingly great mobile game. That video might take me a while, but if you want to see it when it comes out, then don't forget to subscribe. And yes, there is a multiplayer for Dead Space 2, but I don't remember my EA login, and I don't care enough to get a new one. As far as I know, some people still play it, and I remember it being pretty fun. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I will see you in whatever I do next.